Story 1. Well, first things first, I suffer from some pretty bad insomnia. Usually I'm lucky to get 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. I've tried melatonin pills, herbal tea, and tons of home remedies, but none have worked, so I've learned to live with it. Usually with copious amounts of caffeine. Because I had trouble sleeping, I would often go on walks at night. Sometimes I would even hop in my old truck and head out to a nearby hiking trail. I live in semi-rural Montana, so there are several trails nearby that I've hiked, and these are the same ones I visit once the sun has set. Now, there are some dangers, of course. There are bears, but they're not really nocturnal. Bobcats are small and will run rather than fight, but mountain lions are my biggest concern. They can stalk you and you would never know they were there. This thought spooked me, but lion attacks were rare, and I always carried a knife on my belt while out, which brought a small amount of comfort. It was on one of these nights that I found something much worse. It was a quiet night, only the sound of nocturnal insects and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The moon was nearly full, so I had no trouble finding my way as I made my way through the trees to one of my favourite spots. I was always off the regular trail headed to a place my friends and I had discovered some time ago. It was a small meadow on the mountainside, surrounded by tall pines with a fantastic view of the star-filled sky above. I took a seat and leaned against an old log at the edge of the clearing, letting out a content sigh. Pulling a water bottle from my pack, I took a drink before allowing the night to surround me in all its quiet wonder. The animals of the forest began to become more active after I stopped rustling around and settled. Insects hummed and clicked. Owls and other night birds began to call to one another. I even saw a great horned owl swoop low over the meadow, searching for a meal. A small movement in the trees caught my eye, and as I watched, several deer made their way into the meadow, heads scanning back and forth as they cautiously approached. I smiled to myself. They couldn't see me if I stayed still, and couldn't smell me as I was downwind. I simply watched for a time as they fed on the grass, not 100 feet away. After a while, I discreetly glanced at my watch. 2:37 a.m. My eyes were feeling a bit heavy, and I knew it was about time to head home and get some proper sleep. I decided to watch for a minute longer before leaving, which would no doubt startle the deer. It was in this time that their behaviour suddenly changed. Now, deer are skittish by nature. They will run if you so much as look at them, and the entire time I had been there they had seemed unconcerned, simply glancing about now and then for any signs of danger. However, now all of their heads were raised and they stood perfectly still save for the ears rotating in all directions. Had they smelled me? No. I was still downwind. Maybe another animal from the far side of the meadow had spooked them. Intrigued, I watched for a few more minutes, waiting to see if anything would show. In that time, the deer stayed alert, only a few tentatively eating before raising their heads again. In this time, the wind began to pick up and I noticed some clouds in the sky. I pulled my jacket collar up and continued to scan the tree line for any signs. The wind made this very hard. Pine boughs bounced and shook in the wind and the trees gently rocked back and forth. Except one. Off to the right of the meadow, under the larger trees it stood. At first I thought it was just a dead tree, a branchless husk. But I visit this place often and had never seen it before. I peered at it. Some clouds were beginning to cross the moonlight, and the moving shadows with the wind made focusing in the dark incredibly difficult. Then the cloud passed the moon, and in the light I saw a sight that chilled me to the bone. Though it was still quite dark, I could make out a form. It was not a tree. It was something. Something inhuman and terrifying. It stood easily 10 feet tall on 2 legs. Long arms hung at the sides of its slender yet powerful body. Its head was obscured by the shadow of the trees it was under, but I could vaguely make it out. Longer than a regular human's and covered in what looked like matted hair. In fact, the whole creature was. It stood completely motionless, still downwind from the deer, though it seemed its very presence was enough to frighten them. At this time, I noticed one of the most chilling sounds I hope never to hear again in those woods. Silence. The birds and the insects had stopped. The wind had died down to nearly nothing. It became quiet enough that I feared my own breath could be heard by that thing. I dared not move. I was terrified and did not want to risk being seen. Dozens of questions buzzed in my mind. How long had it been there? Was it dangerous? Was it here the whole time? My next thought made my heart drop. Did it see me come here? Did it know where I was? It wasn't looking at me as far as I could tell, but at the deer, which stood in the meadow. I began to wonder what to do next, when it attacked. Loping from the trees, it was so unbelievably quiet. I expected the crash of underbush, thudding footsteps, even some sort of awful roar or scream. Nothing. It ran on all fours towards the herd. By the time the animals had even seen it, it was far too late. It caught the nearest and pinned it to the ground with massive claws I had not seen earlier. The others scattered into the forest. I watched in horror as it knelt over the struggling creature. There was an audible crunch and the deer went limp. I took a rag breath as quietly as possible. It wasn't looking at me. It was focused on its kill. This could be my chance. I slowly stood, ignoring the stiffness in my legs. It was eating, that much I knew. I could hear the tear of flesh and chewing from there. It was still hunched over, its head jerking as it ripped another morsel from the body of the deer. I began to back away, placing my feet carefully as to make no sound. And that's when I stepped on a branch. I cursed in my mind, my eyes darting to my foot before glancing up again. Maybe it hadn't. It was staring right at me. Those eyes, they reflected the moonlight in two massive pools of white. They seemed to look past me, so bright I could not make out the other features of its face. My heart turned to ice, and I felt a chill run through my very soul. Its head had turned before I could even realize what had happened. Its body turned, and that movement brought me out of my stupor, and I turned and ran. I plowed through the forest. Branches and bushes scraped my exposed skin as I passed. I felt one of my ankles twist with a pang of agony, but I had to keep running. I was driven by fear and did not want to think about how close it could be. I reached the main trail and ran even faster, taking huge strides as I sprinted downhill. I felt the same ankle twist again and let out a cry of pain, but continued, now running with a limp. Before long, I had reached the dirt parking lot of the trailhead and ran to my truck, throwing open the door and practically diving inside before slamming it behind me. I breathed heavily, laying on the seats as I stared at the roof of the car. I listened as well, but heard nothing. Daring a look, I poked my head up over the dash. Nothing. Just the dark line of the trees and the trail leading into the blackness. Feeling more confident, I sat up in the seat, keeping my eyes glued to the forest, which remained motionless. I breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps that thing was too busy with its meal or just had no interest in a chase. Either way, I was safe. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several moments to finally fish them out. I started my truck and reached down to flip on the headlights. When I looked back, however, my breath caught in my throat. There were the eyes. Far into the forest, past what the lights illuminated, but there was no doubt that those were the reflective eyes of that monster, peering at me from the distant darkness. Panic kicked in again, and gravel flew in all directions as I sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look in the mirrors. I made it home soon and ran inside, locking the deadbolt behind me. I did not sleep at all that night. As I said earlier, it's been several weeks since that encounter. I've tried to find out what it might have been. Though I read up on Sasquatch, Wendigos, and other mythical creatures, nothing truly fits the description of what I saw. I don't go into the woods at night anymore, and hardly at all during the day. I'll try to keep you informed of my findings, if any, and any local happenings that could be tied to it. But so far, nothing has seemed out of the ordinary. Those eyes still haunt me, and needless to say, my insomnia has not improved. Story 2. It's been about 1 year since Phil had gone missing. He was a typical college student who had just finished his second year of college. When he got home, he went into the kitchen in order to get something to eat. After he sat down, his mother walked in and asked, "How you doing since the school year is over?" Phil responded with, "I'm glad I'll have some more free time, but I'm worried I'll be bored due to having nothing to do." His mother then suggested, "Why don't you do a little bit of traveling?" Phil responded with, "I wish I could, but I don't really have enough money to do that." Phil's mum then told him not to worry about it and that her and Phil's dad will pay for it. Phil then thanked his mother and decided to spend 4 weeks traveling to different places while filming all the things he saw. 2 weeks later, the day to leave had finally arrived. As he was saying goodbye to his mum and dad, his parents told him to call them as often as possible so they would know that he was safe. Phil agreed to do it, said goodbye, and left. For the first 2 weeks of the trip, Phil travelled to different cities and towns along the east coast of the United States. He went to New York City, Philadelphia, Cape Cod, and various other places. He called his parents every day during this time, but 3 days before Phil was supposed to return home, the calls had suddenly stopped. Phil was someone who would frequently lose things, and his parents thought he might have just lost his cell phone. However, when the day he was supposed to come home arrived and Phil never showed up, his parents finally called the police. After a few months of searching, Phil still hadn't been found, and there was still no evidence of what had happened to him. After a year had passed since Phil went missing, his parents got a call from the police. They told his parents that someone in Maine had been fishing in a lake, and their hook got caught on a camera that had Phil's name on it. His parents were told the last thing they wanted to hear. The police said that since the camera was waterproof, it still worked. When they looked at the footage on the camera, they found footage of Phil's death. Phil's parents went down to the police station in order to see the video showing Phil's death. The police asked them if they were sure that they wanted to see it, and they said they needed closure. The video started out with Phil on a boat whilst filming the water. Like many other lakes and ponds, you could only see through the water near the surface, and other than that, there's nothing but darkness under there. After a few minutes, a horrifying creature slowly swims upward out of the darkness. Phil naturally screams and moves back. When he did this, the boat started rocking, which caused him and his camera to fall into the water. As the camera slowly sank to the bottom of the lake, it caught the sight of Phil struggling to get away as the creature pulled him into the darkness. Story 3. In the Virginia mountains, roads go directly through mountains, via tunnels dug through them. Last year, I was travelling from Florida up to the Midwest and took the route that took me through the aforementioned Virginia mountains. The trip went fine until I got there. Normally, I found myself driving either alone or with 1 or 2 other cars on the road. At one point, though, traffic became heavy. I was in a line of cars approaching a tunnel. It was moving slow due to some unseen obstruction ahead. I entered the tunnel and crept along slowly with the rest of the cars before coming to a stop. The westbound road was at a standstill, while the eastbound road was wide open with no cars heading in that direction. I was almost dead center of the tunnel, just for reference. Lights lined the walls of the tunnel, illuminating everything within. Until they didn't. All the lights simultaneously shut off, making it quite dark in the tunnel. Sunlight was the only source of light in the tunnel now, but it only reached so far from the entrance. Me, being in the middle, I was essentially in the dark. A car a few behind me pulled into the eastbound side and sped ahead of the rest of us that was stopped. I redirected my attention to him and watched him drive the rest of the way down the tunnel. And when he reached the end, all of the sunlight coming from that end of the tunnel was suddenly sucked out of existence, and the car disappeared. All I could see at the end of the tunnel was pure darkness. I looked behind me and saw cars starting to turn around, but shortly after, a wave of darkness fell over the entrance through which I'd driven just minutes before. I heard random screams from either end of the tunnel. The only thing giving off light now was all the cars' headlights, but those seemed somehow dimmer than they should have. In all, it was like being in a pitch-black room with only a candle across the room giving off any kind of glow. I opened my door in preparation to get out and see what was going on, but just as it was open all the way, something flew past and slammed it shut, surely denting it in the process. Whatever it was, it went by so fast that I didn't see it, and its path was interrupted by my car door. I tried looking behind me to see what it was, and saw the vague outline of something big heading down the road behind me. The person in front of me got out of their car and looked in both directions. Suddenly, that same thing that flew past my door flew back the other way and took the man in front of me with him. All I heard was his scream trail off in the distance. At this point, I was thoroughly frightened. I didn't know what to do. I heard screams coming from whatever direction that thing was coming from at the time. I needed to figure out what it was in order to figure out how to deal with it and protect myself. I snuck out the passenger's side door of my car and crawled to the car in front of me. I then entered through the passenger side of that car and got into the driver's seat. The thing made a few passes back and forth as I waited for a moment, and the second it passed by heading westbound, I pulled the car into the middle of the road and hurriedly got out, running back to my car and getting in safely. The thing made its pass back eastbound and slammed into the car, crumpling it almost in half. But more importantly than that, it stopped, and even in the dim lights being projected from my car, I finally got a look at it. Whatever this thing was, it barely fit on the other lane of the tunnel. I would say that it was probably 15 feet long and had to have been another 15 feet around in a cylindrical shape. It looked like a floating millipede, only without so many legs. It had tendrils coming off its body in random places that seemed to wave in the air behind it as it sped by. I realized that it was in fact on the ground and not flying like I had previously thought. It was just moving so fast that I couldn't see it touching the road beneath it. It looked wet, as if it was covered in some sort of fine slime. And I don't know how I hadn't realized up to that point that it was digging into the ground beneath it with each pass, and in the rubble, leaving a trail of moisture behind it. Its face was flat. It had 4 lidless, colourless eyes, just black spheres set deep inside the sockets that housed them. There were 3 small holes under the eyes that I presume were nostrils. The mouth, though, was the most horrifying thing about it. Its mouth was a perfect circle that closed from the top and the bottom, but it had 3 full circular sets of razor-sharp teeth that by this point were coated in blood. Its entire face had blood splattered on it and glass sticking out of it, evidence of carnage it was employing on either end of the tunnel, surely making its way to the middle where I was. I can only guess that there was another face on the other side because this thing would have had no room to make a turn to head back in the opposite direction, and damage was being done on both ends of the tunnel. Hitting the car only stopped it for a few moments. It nudged the car aside into a car only a few behind mine and went back on its way. I could tell it was getting closer to the middle because the times between its passes were getting shorter and shorter, and the screams were getting louder. Someone ahead of me got out of their car brandishing a pistol when the thing was heading east and waited for it to come back. He got off 2 shots that seemed to do absolutely nothing to the thing, and even in the very dim light I saw the man's blood spray in every direction as his scream was quickly suppressed. If I hadn't been panicking before, I certainly was at this point. This thing was getting closer and closer, and I had literally nowhere to go. Both directions were closed off, and even if they weren't, there would be no way for me to get to either ends without first being ravaged by this thing. Suddenly there was a deafening screech that echoed throughout the enclosed tunnel. It got louder and louder until the sound was literally so loud I couldn't see anything anymore. Everything began vibrating, and then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I opened my eyes and saw sunlight ahead of me. I turned around and saw it behind me as well. In addition, the lights had gotten their power back. But what I didn't see was a large cylindrical monster that was making passes back and forth, eviscerating human beings. It was simply gone. As a result of the light returning, I saw the carnage left behind by the unexplainable creature. Everything beyond 3 car lengths from me in either direction was absolutely destroyed. Cars were split in half, bodies were in pieces, blood and viscera lined the streets and walls of the tunnel. The eastbound side of the road was dug up about 3 feet down from the thing going back and forth. I got out of my car and walked to meet the other survivors. No one could believe what they'd just seen. The police and ambulances came, news crews, helicopters, the whole shebang. Everyone gave their statements, which all came out nearly identical. Men in black suits came by and spoke to us one by one, marking things down on a clipboard. Then they had us sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for money. The story in the news was a truck carrying hazardous material had crashed and spilled, destroying the road and taking many casualties along with it. It was all bullshit. I know what happened that day, and I don't care about a non-disclosure agreement. If they're going to come for me, let them. At least now other people know. There is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, shit out there that's being kept from us. And it's dangerous. Story 4. The following story is told from the perspective of a female. I'm a student at the University of Alabama. For privacy's sake, I'll say my name is Vikki. Despite your initial ideas about the South, particularly Alabama, it's a lot different than you might believe. There are plenty of places that are diverse and tolerant, a veritable melting pot of cultures, ethnicities, and religions. What I'm about to share with you does not occur in one of those places. To every one city full of life and excitement, there are 5 towns that barely have the population to warrant a spotlight. These towns have existed for many a generation, and the gene pools that are present now do not deviate much from those of the town founders. I suffer from a bit of an ailment. I get bored really easily and I have next to no friends, so when I get bored, I get really bored. It was this very ennui that brought me to my current state, curled up in a ball and chain-smoking like a fiend in my apartment, desperately trying to convince myself that I am not crazy. It was a Thursday evening in late October when I was struck with a desire to go exploring. The sun had set and I had absolutely nothing to do. Possessing a car and a sense of adventure, I decided to head out for a late-night joyride. Once you get outside the city limits of Tuscaloosa, you can drive for a great many miles on country highways before you reach any semblance of civilization. It was on one of those ill-maintained roads that I found myself nearly 2 hours later, out of gas. I cursed when the ping of gaslight echoed softly through the car. There I was, in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, Alabama, with a dead cell phone, an empty tank of gas, and no real idea of where the next gas station would be. And then, lo and behold, the glow of a Chevron station emanated through the trees. I said a silent prayer and pulled up to one of the pumps. I was the only car on the lot, but that wasn't particularly surprising. See my aforementioned comment about my location if you need clarification. After fueling up, I decided to take a quick bathroom break before heading home for the night. That's when I first realized something was wrong. Aside from a light at the entrance, the entire building was dark. I searched everywhere for a clerk, but there was no one. None of this made any sense. If the gas station was closed, why did the pump still work? At this point, I was sufficiently spooked, so I decided to save the bathroom break until I was somewhere a little better lit. With one final look around me, I was back on the road home. I was cruising at a solid 90 miles per hour with the windows down and the radio blaring when I saw it. There, in the beam of my headlights, was a small person. I should clarify, I don't mean a child or even a dwarf. This was a perfectly proportional tiny human. It barely registered what I was seeing before it was too late. I ran it over. I felt the sickening crunch of its body under my wheels, and without hesitating, I slammed on the brakes. Running around my car, I was greeted by a grisly scene. The creature was no longer in one piece. Its head was the consistency of a melon that had been curb-stomped, and everything below its sternum was a pudding of blood, intestines, and bits of bone. I vomited on the spot. With my head between my legs, I had a clear view of the woods behind me. It was from those dense pine trees that a multitude of little creatures began to swarm. I use that word because it seemed the most fitting. They did not move like humans. Limbs contorted in ways that should have broken bones. A dry, skittering noise was all that could be heard as they made their approach. It was terrifying. I felt sure I would meet a similar fate as their fallen brethren, but they barely paid any attention to me. They were thoroughly engrossed by the creature I had killed. It was almost heartwarming, until the tenderness in their tiny eyes turned into something that can only be described as bloodlust. They shoveled handfuls of flesh and gore into their mouths, snuffling and fighting to get more. I pressed myself into the bumper of my car and closed my eyes, sure that I would be the next course. I braced myself for the sting of hundreds of minute teeth ripping into my body. But such pain never arrived. I opened my eyes to complete silence. It almost appeared that nothing had happened. The only thing out of place being a slight stain on the hood of my car. Every other sign that I had just killed a tiny person was gone. At this point, I was in sheer panic mode. I threw open the car door, slammed my foot on the gas, and drove off as fast as I could. With one final glance in the rear-view mirror, I could almost swear I saw a group of tiny human creatures disappearing into the forest. For the past week, I have searched every available source to get some idea of what happened to me that night. I have spent hours on the internet and in the library, poring through old newspaper articles and checking online maps. The results have been disappointing. All I can find is an old article about a gas station being shut down in the late 90s. No particular reasons are given, but I think it was the gas station I encountered on that quiet country road. More digging has revealed that this derelict gas station is only a few miles away from the abandoned town of Lazarus, Alabama. It keeps me up at night now. The idea that perhaps Lazarus is not quite as deserted as one might believe. Thank you for watching and or listening to this video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want to hear more of my scary stories, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Thank you to all of my current subscribers. You really do help my channel to grow and encourage me to keep going. In the description of this video are links to my personal and dedicated horror channel Twitter accounts. Go ahead and follow if you want to be up to date with everything that's going on with this channel.